Good morning, everyone. It's 10 o'clock, and I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this episode of the Bookworm. I think we're on episode 22. So thank you so much for all of your wonderful support this summer. Just a reminder that we will be recording today's session to share online later. And since you're signed up for the Bookworm, you'll receive an email with a copy, with a link of that recording and any other resources that we discussed today. Just a quick tutorial. I see people are starting to chime in the chat section, so please continue to do that. One of the reasons we wanted to have these programs was to maintain some of that wonderful camaraderie that we feel when we get together in person for our programs. So please go ahead and chime in the chat function. Select all panelists and attendees so that we can all see your comments, and you'll notice that the conversation goes by very quickly. Because of this, if you have questions for today's panelists, please put them in the Q&A section. In the Q&A, you can ask questions. You can also give a thumbs up to other questions, and that helps to sort the order of the queue for the questions. Those with more thumbs up head to the top of the queue. And if you have comments or answers to post with someone else's question or your own question, you can go ahead and type them in, and it keeps them together there in the Q&A. My colleagues Ann Bennington-Helber and Tracy Payovich will be monitoring the chat, answering questions, and also pasting in helpful links along the way. So thank you, Ann and Tracy, for that help. In addition, if you're new to Zoom, I can control some of what you see, but then you have a lot of options. So I want to point out that when I'm sharing the screen like this, you can choose to be in side-by-side mode, and that gives you the option of sliding how much of the speaker and how much of the slides you see. When we're all speaking, when we're all participating, you can also switch between gallery view, which will show all three speakers, and just speaker mode, which shows whoever's talking. In addition, because we're committed to our diversity, equity, and inclusion program, we do have the transcription turned on this morning. If you find that distracting, you can toggle that off. Okay, I think that gives you some good ideas about how you might be able to customize your screen, and I hope you enjoy it. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library enables the discovery, learning, teaching of American history through the collection, conservation, digitization, and availability of primary sources on paper. And today, we're thrilled to welcome two of our former fellows. So they had the opportunity to come and study at the Clements Library and really delve into those primary sources, and will tell us more about their research today. So I'm pleased to welcome Guillaume Teasdale and Andrew Sturtevant, and I'll introduce them more in a moment. If you haven't had a chance yet to participate in the poll, today we did something a little bit different. We're testing your knowledge of Detroit history, so you can click on your answers there. I'll give you one more minute to go ahead and click on those before we take a look at the answers. And tell you that today's episode is generously sponsored by Tom Wagner. Thanks so much, Tom, for supporting us in this and many other ways. Tom grew up in the Detroit area where his family has been since the 1870s. So this was a very fitting sponsor. Thanks again. All right, who's ready to close the opening poll? Did everybody test their knowledge? All right, I'm going to end the polling and give you the answers. Okay, so where does the name Detroit come from? So Detroit is actually French for the strait. And of course, like many things, we have started to pronounce it a little bit differently. Instead of Detroit, now it's Detroit. And when was Detroit founded? On July 24th, 1701, a French explorer and nobleman by the name of Antoine, oh, and my French is so bad, and Guillaume, I
Antoine de
feel
la
like
Motte.
thank you. I feel like I shouldn't even try. I'm like, oh no. He founded Detroit. Thank you for helping me out with that. And what was the fort in Detroit called? So all of the answers were, it was all of the above. Detroit, the fort started out as Fort Lenox and then was officially renamed as Fort Detroit in 1805, and then once again renamed Fort Shelby in 1813, and was demolished by the city of Detroit in 1827 once its military use had ended. So hopefully you all learned a little something fun about Detroit this morning, and you'll learn some more about Detroit as our panelists talk today. So first, I would like to welcome Guillaume Teasdale. He is assistant professor and undergraduate advisor in the Department of History at the University of Windsor in Ontario. He specializes in the colonial history of the Great Lakes region and the history of French North America. In 2019, he published his first book, Fruits of Perseverance, The French Presence in the Detroit River Region, 1701 to 1815. He is currently working on a project to better understand the status of the French language in public life in Ontario, Michigan, Illinois, Missouri, and Louisiana during the first half of the 19th century. His research has been supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the William L. Clements Library as the 2009 Price Visiting Research Fellow, the Bentley Historical Library, the American Philosophical Society, the Couchois Center for the Study of American Catholicism, and the Center for French Colonial Studies. He received his PhD from Toronto's York University. So Guillaume, welcome to the program this morning.
Very much.
Well, why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about your book?
Yeah, it's a book that I started that project as a PhD dissertation. Like I say at the very beginning of my book, I was born in Ontario, Northern Ontario, close to where you have Sudbury today. But I grew up in Quebec. I grew up in a very francophone place in Quebec, Trois-Rivières. And so basically, I did not speak English up until I was like 25. When I started when I left Quebec to go back to Ontario to study, I was always curious about French-speaking people who live outside of Quebec, because today a lot of people know that in Quebec the vast majority of people speak French, but in Quebec itself, French Canadians are not aware anymore of other communities, other French communities outside of Quebec. And so I wanted to study that. And at first I was interested in perhaps looking at French people in Illinois, like also St. Louis, Missouri. But then I felt that I was at the beginning of my PhD research. Then I felt that other historians were already researching that history. So I was like, what about Detroit? So I started to wonder, maybe I should focus on Detroit. So the first summer of my PhD studies, after the first year, I came from Toronto. I came to the archives in Detroit, and I discovered a lot of sources, so many more than I thought. A lot of them were written in French. And I know that historians in Quebec did not know anything about these sources. And also my professors at York University were very surprised. They did not expect me to find that many sources. It was kind of overwhelming in the beginning, and I was trying to make sense to find the right approach to use these sources because I could not use all of them for my dissertation. There were just too many. So that's how I started. And I eventually focused on land occupation, the way the French people organized the land, because I wanted to look beyond Fort Detroit, the French people that were living all around Fort Detroit. And in fact, uh, the vast majority of French people in the Detroit River region did not live in the fort, but in the nearby areas. So, and they were farmers. So I focused on that for my dissertation. And then after a few years after my PhD, I started to transform my dissertation into a book. And so I improved some parts. I added a whole new chapter. Chapter 7 is a chapter that you don't find in my dissertation. And the book was published in 2019. And it's not the end of my research on the French people. In a way, it's the beginning, because now I'm using that I'm building on that, and I'm exploring other questions relating to the French people in the Detroit River region. So I'm in the process of applying for grant proposals to keep researching that topic.
That's great. Thank you so much. Um, so you mentioned that you were a little overwhelmed by how many sources you found. So maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the tools that you use to organize your research, and how you found a way to sort of bring it all together into focus.
Well, like I said, I started to, I felt like I had to find one specific approach. And I also realized that the vast majority of these sources were pertaining to land transaction. I was surprised to discover that they were actually French notaries in Detroit during New France, but also after New France. New France ended in 1760 with the conquest of Canada by the British. And I was surprised to discover that there were actually more French notaries living in Detroit after 1760. And so at that time, we have to keep in mind that Detroit was really isolated from the East Coast, from Quebec. And I know it's hard to imagine today because people who live in Metro Detroit have like connections to the rest of the US, Boston, New York, and other places. But at that time, and up until the 1810s, 1820s, Detroit was much more connected to a place like Montreal. It took like, it's not until the completion of the Erie Canal in 1825 that Detroit became more connected to the East Coast of the US. So yes, there were a lot of notaries that were living in Detroit, and for such an isolated place, you would think that things must have been chaotic, that people did not really record land transactions and things like that. But no, it's quite the opposite. The French people that were living in the area made sure that everything was on paper and that everything was approved by a notary. So we have all these sources in the archives today. So that's what I focused on. But I was still missing some very important pieces of information about what was French Detroit exactly in terms of land occupation. And I found the information that I was looking for at the Clements Library in the Thomas Gage papers when I discovered this report written by the French notary Robert Navarre in 1766. Basically, he was explaining to British authorities in New York City how it worked in Detroit before the conquest, because British authorities after the conquest had no clue. So he explained how it worked. So it was a regime that was very similar to what you found in Quebec, but it was a little bit different at the same time. And I talk about that in my book. So basically, the fact that there were notaries that were keeping track of all the transactions and everything by the late 18th century, when on the British side, British authorities start to standardize, regulate land occupation, and the Americans started to do the same a few years later, around 1804, 1805. Both authorities, they have access to a lot of documents explaining the history of each tract of land. And what we see here right now is a map from 1810 of Detroit. And you see the fort is like tiny. It's like right in the middle. And But everything else around is long and narrow pieces of land. We call them ribbon farms in English. And it's very similar to the farms in Quebec. The shape of these lands was to give access to as many people as possible to the river, because the rivers at that time were like highways. There were very few inland roads, and that way it was much more effective for people to move around, to have access to the river. In Quebec, it happened that similar farms were laid out right behind. Um, but in the Detroit area, not on the American side, not really. On the Canadian side, we don't see it on this map, but it's very similar at that time. And in fact, there's rows, first row by the river, but there's also a second and a third row in what is Windsor, Ontario today. So Windsor, Ontario was built right on top of former French farms, and so is Detroit in many ways.
So here you had given us this other map, which is just lovely. And I know you mentioned that you found some of these maps in a surprising place.
Yes. I mean, the map that we just saw before, I found it in at the Monroe County Museum in Monroe, Michigan. And the maps were pretty large, like 7 feet by 5 feet. So not easy to digitize, but the people there helped me. They had a scanner that was big enough at the city of Monroe, and they scanned 2 maps for me, the one that we saw and another one. And because Monroe, Michigan was very similar to Detroit, it was all French farms. And so that's why I have these maps that are pretty high quality right now, and that I can use that in many ways. So that was another turning point in my research, to discover these maps. There's a third one that it pertains to the St. Clair area, Lake St. Clair, but at the museum they did not have a map of that. I came across that map online, but I've never found a very good quality version of it. So this one here, it's available online. It's a map from 1855, and it shows how Detroit was still fairly small, and it was surrounded by French farms. Even if, in fact, some of the people living on these farms were not necessarily French, uh, the shape of these farms was still right there, hadn't changed. And some of you might know that in 1805, the town of Detroit burned to the ground, and it was rebuilt, and that local American politicians had plans to, instead of just rebuilding the town of Detroit, to plan a large city. But that took a long time to happen, because the French farms were surrounding the city. So the expansion of Detroit was kind of delayed. And sometimes you see in some sources that the French people are happy to sell their land because they made a lot of money. That's not true. In fact, a lot of local Americans living in Detroit were very annoyed by the French people who refused to sell their farms, so to allow the growth of Detroit. So that's another thing that I'm hoping to study further in the next few years, to see how that happened, why it took longer than anticipated, and that kind of thing.
Great, thank you. Did you use some of these maps in your book?
I used the ones that we saw before, the 1855 map, not yet, because I actually discovered that map about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago. So it really struck me, because I didn't think that in 1855 the old French farms were still there, especially so close to the town of Detroit. In Grosse Pointe, Michigan, along the River Rouge, I knew that some of these farms were still there in the early 20th century. And something that is very interesting, the Ford River Rouge plant in Dearborn was built. Basically, Henry Ford had to purchase old French farms to build his plant, and he purchased that in the early 20th century. He purchased that some land from a local French family. So there's still so much to research. I have more publications coming up, so I'm not stopping. I keep researching, and I'm loving it.
Great. So, in your book, I'm sure that as you were doing this research, there were particular families that whose stories you tell, and whose stories really stand out. Can you tell us maybe about one of those?
Yeah, there's a few families that stick out for different reasons. There's one family, the Maisonville family. In English, we say Masonville. Um, and they're still present in the area today. I used to work out in Windsor with descendants of these people, and I was telling them about their ancestors, and they were very surprised. Alexis Maisonville in the 1760s, after the British conquest, British authorities refused to recognize any land claims by the French people in Detroit because on paper, according to the Royal Proclamation of 1763 by Britain, the French people were not supposed to be in the Great Lakes. They were not supposed to be living on farms along the Detroit River. So initially, British authorities looked at them like as squatters, and they were telling them, you can't be here, you shouldn't be on your farms. But French people were not going anywhere. So, but yeah, so this man, what he did in 1771 is that he walked from Detroit to New York City, and there was no road in between. So he went to meet with Thomas Gage, the commander-in-chief of British forces in North America at that time. And he met with him in person. And that's the kind of thing I discovered at the Clements Library. Thomas Gage is writing to the officer in Detroit, and he's saying, I just received a visit from this guy, Maisonville from Detroit, and he's not happy about his land claims, but I can't do anything to help him because he's not supposed to be there. But it turns out that the French didn't go anywhere. Maisonville stayed there. He was a farmer. And his son, his oldest son, in the early 19th century, they were living on the Canadian side of the river. The border was created in 1796. In the early 19th century, the French people are still used to crossing the river. They don't really feel like there is a border now. And they take, like his son took some grain across the river to a windmill to make flour and bring it back to use for himself. And he got arrested by the customs, and they said, you need to pay a tax if you try to bring stuff into Detroit. And he said, I don't have to pay tax because that's what we've been doing for like generations. And so he sued the territory of Michigan, and he won. And the territory of Michigan, the Supreme Court of the territory of Michigan said that only people of French descent living on the Canadian side were allowed to not pay tax, custom tax, when they do that. So, so it's like a family thing that they were sticking up for themselves, fighting for their rights. So that's a very interesting story.
It is indeed, yes. So I think one of the things that people often think when they hear that we have the Thomas Gage papers is they often think, oh, okay, so that's probably just a bunch of military papers. But maybe you could just comment on that a little bit, because I mean, this story that you tell from the papers really helps to illustrate what what a varied resource those papers really are.
Yes, when you look at the papers, it's really obvious that the British are much more concerned, and almost only concerned with their relations with the indigenous people. I would say that's probably 95% of the contents of the Talmadge Gates papers focus on these things. But I realized that there's another 5% that dealt with the French people, and that's where I found all my information. So there's so much more information in these papers, and people working on Indigenous British relations will find a whole lot of information. But for me, it was really about that 5% that maybe historians using the Talmadge Gates papers maybe thought that was not as important. But I was able to find crucial information to make sense of the French presence during New France, but also after New France.
Thank you. Thanks. So, do you have any, I'm going to switch over to Andrew in a moment, and then I'll just remind everybody, I see lots of questions showing up in the Q&A, but if you didn't hear me say before, please do put your questions in the Q&A because we will answer those at the end of the presentation. But do you have anything else you'd like to highlight before we switch over?
I don't think so. I could probably talk about all that for like a couple days, but
Yes.
I think for now, yeah, I think that's very good. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, it's great to have you here, and we'll talk to you a little bit more at the end. So thank you so much for giving us a great look into your research. Next, I would like to welcome Andrew Sturtevant. He is Associate Professor in the Department of History and American Indian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. He specializes in Native American history, 18th century Great Lakes history, and the study of the Atlantic world. He received his PhD in 2011 from William and Mary, and his work at the Clements and his dissertation focused on the rivalry and alliance among the Native communities in Detroit from 1701 to 1766. Andrew won the Robert F. Heiser Prize from the American Society for Ethnohistory for his article, Inseparable Companions and Irreconcilable Enemies, the Hurons and the Ottawas of French Detroit, 1701 to 38. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you.
We'd love to hear some more about your research.
Sure. And I just want to start by thanking you, Angela and Anne, and the Clements for putting on this amazing series of the Clements Bookworm, and to Tom Wagner too for underwriting this particular episode. And I also want to acknowledge that the land I'm sitting on now in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, is colonized land that historically was the homeland of both the Dakotas and the Ojibwas, and I want to honor that and to acknowledge that. Okay, so as you mentioned a little bit, I work on Detroit in a similar period that Guillaume does, but I study a different group of people. I study the indigenous people in this area, and I'm currently working on a monograph based on my dissertation that I've tentatively called Pontiac's Other War, Imperial and Indigenous Politics between 1701 and 1766. And what I'm trying to do is to resituate an event that might be familiar to lots of people who have some familiarity with American history, Pontiac's War, in a new conceptual framework, right? So I'd argue that Pontiac's War should be understood not as it usually is, just as a response to imperialism and to the arrival of the British in this region, but also part of an ongoing power struggle among Native American people living at Detroit and in the immediate region. Right? So in other words, I argue that there are kind of two conflicts going on at the same time. Pontiac's War, a war against the British, but also Pontiac's Other War, which involves conflicts among the Ottawas, Pontiac's people, but also several other people. Right? So I'll talk a little bit about both of those and talk about kind of how they intersect and how they're interrelated. Okay. So I'm guessing a lot of the audience is fairly familiar with Pontiac's War, so I'll just be brief. I'll give a kind of a general overview of that conflict. So prior to 1760, the conquest of Canada, the French had developed relationships with the people in this region. For the most part, and there are lots of caveats here, For the most part, this is a mutually beneficial relationship. I don't want to romanticize that relationship. Certainly there was instability and lots of violence. But for the most part, indigenous people are making economic relations with the French. They're allying them with them in wars against their common enemies. French people are intermarrying into the indigenous kinship networks, kind of becoming part of this larger social network. So all of this kind of fairly mutualistic relationship comes to a crashing halt in 1760 when the British defeat the French. The British come and occupy Detroit and other posts in this region, and they immediately signal that they're not going to play by the same rules that the French had. So they're going to disregard the native diplomatic protocols. They're going to stop giving the customary gifts to Native American people. They're going to stop extending credit. They are going to encroach far more on their land than the French had. And they're also going to consider these people not as autonomous sovereign peoples, but more as conquered subjects. They believe that they've defeated the French and defeated these people as well. So they are going to impose a much more kind of draconian top-down policy. And so almost immediately this sets off alarm bells for the people living here. They very quickly get disgusted with the British rule, and many of them decide we liked it better when the French were here. So they start a military campaign to push the British out in the hope and expectation that the French would come back. They would restore the status quo and things would go back kind of to normal. So many indigenous leaders, including the Odawa man Pontiac, begin a military campaign in 1763. It's immediately pretty successful. The warriors capture most of the posts that the British occupied in the region, and they subject Fort Detroit and Fort Pitt to long sieges that last until the coming autumn. So eventually the British are able to defeat the Allies, but this causes a change in British imperial policy and leads in part to the proclamation of 1763, which bars any British subjects from living west of the Appalachian Mountains, which is a story that Guillaume talked about, touched on a little bit a few minutes ago. And so it's this really impactful touchstone of American history. And this is the way we usually see it, right? We usually think of it as kind of this anti-British campaign. It's kind of this pan-Indian struggle against imperialism, right? So I argue that version of the story certainly is correct and it's true, but it's only part of the story. Pontiac's War was also unfolded in this context of a complicated, decades-long negotiation among different Native peoples living at Detroit. So by the time of Pontiac's War, the people that are living here, the Wyandots, the Odawas, the Ojibwas, the Potawatomis had created this dense lattice of alliances, of rivalries, of competition with one another. So it's not surprising that Pontiac's War would be influenced by this other conflict that I referred to as Pontiac's Other War, right? So the kind of overall thesis of my book is that these two conflicts, the anti-British imperial conflict and the kind of ongoing negotiation of power relations among indigenous people, kind of shape and reshape one another. So we can't really understand Pontiac's War without understanding the indigenous context and this longer range kind of conflict. So the big picture here hinges on a distinction between what I call imperial politics. So by that I mean basically the way in which empire relates to Native American people, right? So the way the British or the French form connections with Native American people. So on one side, we have these imperial politics. On the other side, we have what I call indigenous politics. So this is the set of relationships, the set of power relations that have been worked out among the Native peoples living here in the century before Pontiac's War. And I think these are innately connected, right? So when understood in this context, I think that we can see a story that kind of decenters the British and even decenters the French from the story and it's a much more complicated story, much more actors, and we can see that indigenous action, indigenous agency is actually pretty central to what happens during this conflict.
Thank you. Thanks. So I think it's I love your research, and I think it's interesting also to remind people that Native Americans, even though we sometimes will talk in terms of a big group, as you're saying, it's very distinct groups. So as you looked at your research, I know we have a map to look at here, and I know that you did some research around, oops, sorry, I didn't realize that I needed to click some more. All right.
So
I'll
just a
keep
note
on
about
going.
this slide. So kind of what I'm trying to do here is kind of map these two conflicts together. So what you see in blue is kind of the Pontiac's war, right, his struggle against the British, and then what's in white is Pontiac's kind of conflict with his neighbors, the Wyandots. So you can kind of visually see how these two stories get intertwined in really kind of complicated ways.
All right. So looking at some of the map resources and what you found on these.
Yeah, so this is a map from the French archives, the French Centre d'Archives de Outre-mer, and it kind of gives a sense of the geography before the maps that Guillaume was showing earlier, and you can see kind of the diversity of the indigenous population here at Detroit. So you can kind of make out better in the cutaway detail. Kind of there's a division of land here, right? So south of a line kind of that bisects just north of modern Detroit is a border between the Wyandots, who are living south of this area and claiming a large kind of swath of territory there, and the Ottawas on the other side of that. And in fact, the Wyandots, or at least some of their descendants, are still in this area as well. The Wyandots nation of Anderden is still located in some villages south of Detroit, or some places south of Detroit that have been occupied since the late 18th century. So north of that line, you have the Ottawas, who are kind of the perennial rivals of the Wyandots. You also have you can see here, the village of the Potawatomis, also known as the Badawatamis, who live right adjacent there to the Wyandots. Off of this map, up north of Lake St. Clair, you have a number of Ojibwa villages of people living there. And again, some of the descendants of those people are still on Walpole Island in what's now Ontario. And in fact, many of the Ojibwa, but also Potawatomi and Ottawa people end up there as well. Right? So you can see this, it's an indigenous landscape, that this is kind of a place that's dominated by Native Americans and well into the past Pontiac's War is profoundly kind of an indigenous place.
Thank you. Thanks. So how did you figure out how many people were in the area?
So this is a little bit tricky, but the French and later the British are concerned about military issues. So they are doing a lot of counting. The people in charge are asking the commandants at Detroit, how many warriors are there? How many can we count on if we go to war against the British? So they report out, and those reportings are probably ballpark estimates of how many are there. And then I extrapolate from that. So they're basically saying how many warriors are present. And I extrapolate from that using a formula to try to think of what the actual population would be there. So what you see here is kind of my best guess estimate about how many people are living in Detroit during this period. And you can see there's some fluctuation there. Part of that's because people are coming and leaving. Part of it's because the estimates are just a little bit off. But you can see there's a substantial indigenous population right up until Pontiac's War there.
Interesting, thank you. So tell us a little bit about what sources you used at the Clements Library.
Yeah, so there are some really great sources about the actual conflict itself. So one of the British merchants, James Sterling, kept a logbook during the siege of Detroit, and he includes some comments about what's going on and kind of reflects some of the contemporary British thinking inside the fort of what's going on. But the really kind of the vast majority of my time at the Clements was spent studying the Gage papers that Guillaume talked about earlier. So Gage comes to his position as the commander of British forces right after the hostilities of 1763 end. So he's spending the first couple of years of his administration just trying to figure out, first of all, what's going on, who's in this region, but also how possibly he could patch kind of up this diplomatic mess that has kind of engulfed the Great Lakes region together. So he's seeking out as much information as possible. He's holding conferences, or having his officers hold conferences with indigenous people. So it's a really rich source, not only to understand what the British are thinking and how they're seeing this, but we can also get lots of clues about indigenous perspectives as well, right? So we can see at least what some of these indigenous leaders are telling the British. We see speeches of these people trying to explain, right, this is what we're thinking, and you can see kind of the texture of that, those indigenous politics, the texture of relations going on there. So it's a tremendous resource for people interested in studying this, these issues in this period.
Thank you, thanks. You hinted at the fact that you're writing a book. So what are your plans for publishing your work?
Sure. So I hope to finish a draft of the manuscript in the next couple of years. And I've talked with a couple of publishers about what the prospects of that would be. So I'm hoping to get some of this material. I'm hoping to publish perhaps an article that captures some of this as well before that as well. So and depending on kind of how things progress with the pandemic and issues going on, I hope fairly soon to have some of this in print.
Great, thank you. I'd love for just to talk to both of you about how your work intersects. You had mentioned that you had the opportunity to visit Guillaume in Windsor, and I know that you're both always writing and working. So maybe you could talk a little bit about whether you have any collaborations in the works.
I'll let Andrew.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because we're studying these kind of two communities that are in some ways right beside one another. And I think that there are some really interesting parallels between what's going on with what Guillaume is saying with the French habitants, kind of trying to navigate the changes that are ushered in by the British presence in the area, and the story that I tell about indigenous people kind of trying to figure out how to position themselves, how to survive in kind of this rapidly changing world. And I think also this theme of perseverance is also really important for both, because as Guillaume mentioned, this French presence doesn't just kind of conk out, doesn't end in 1760, and continues until in some ways continues until today. And I think there are parallels here in which there are still some of the descendants of the people I talk about living and working in this region today. So I think that there are kind of really interesting connections and parallels there.
Yeah, I agree. And also that like something I see in the sources is that um, in the second half of the 18th century, as you get closer to the end of the 18th century, the French people are realize that they have to make choices about their relations with indigenous people. They had friendly relations with them. In some cases, that leads to intermarriage. Um, but they also have to make choices because they realize that things are changing. And especially when the Americans take over Michigan, 1796, the French people living on the American side, they all have family members on the other side, but they stay, most of them stay where they are. And they realize that the U.S. is coming, taking over, and there's no going back. So it's in their best interest to focus on developing relations with the U.S. government than trying to resist or to side with the indigenous people against the U.S. or anything like that. Their interests are different, and it's becoming clearer and clearer. Um, and it's something that we also I forget his name, another historian talked about in an article about the French people in Vincennes, Indiana. It's very similar. They have good relations, but they have to be careful, and they don't want to be they don't want the Americans to think that they side with the indigenous people against the Americans. So there's that kind of dynamic happening in the second half of the 18th century.
Right, right. Thank you. So in terms of collaborations, I know that you're both constantly writing. So what, maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So one of the things, one of the areas that we're collaborating on is a book that I'm co-editing with Karen Marrero, who's also a former Clements fellow, trying to capture what has become just a kind of a transformative interest in early Detroit. So we have contributions from Guillaume, but also from folks like Florence Hatter, who works on the later 18th and early 19th century and talks about how people navigate the creation of an international border. We have contributions from Kaya Miles about African-American people in this area. So what we're trying to do here is kind of distill some of this moment about early Detroit and really kind of rethink how we see this period. One of the great things about Guillaume's book is how it helps us kind of transform our narratives about Detroit as just kind of this isolated fur trade and think about how it's connected to other places. So one of the things that I think that we want to accomplish with this book is to show those connections and to show what's going on here, but also the really exciting research that's been happening the last decade or so in this area.
Nice. That's exciting. When are you thinking that might be published?
So hopefully we're trying to get that to the press in the next several months, hopefully by the end of the year, early next year. So
nice. Congratulations to both of you on that. And I'll also give a quick shout out about Karen Marrero's book as well. Her book is Detroit's Hidden Channels. And she was indeed a fellow as well. She was a 2004 Price Fellow and a 2012 Earhart Foundation Fellow. So we're so glad to see all of you working together and having such great success in your research. So I am going to just do a couple of wrap-up slides and then we'll get to the Q&A. So thank you so much for your presentations so far. I'll let everybody know that this episode is the last of our weekly episodes. We decided in the fall that we will have the Bookworm go once a month. So our next session will be September 18th, and it's a collector's corner with Kevin Hugh Lynch, and he will be discussing the Lynch archives and highlighting rare and unique music title pages. So I hope that you will join us for that. As usual, you will receive a reminder email an hour before the episode starts, so you can look forward to that. And you will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording, just as you'll receive a link to the recording and any resources that we talk about today. Thank you so much to everyone who has supported the Bookworm along the way. And today, thank you so much to Tom Wagner. Of course, if you're interested in sponsoring one of our future Bookworms, please contact me or Anne to talk a little bit more about that. Part of the reason that we're going to change to once per month is we have decided to continue doing some of our fall, we usually have a fall lecture series, so where we are taking that virtual, and we have some really great speakers lined up, as well as a Discover series about our upcoming online exhibit. So those are some really great things to keep an eye out for. We will have more information in September's e-newsletter, as well as the links to register for the programs, and it'll be very similar format in terms of being on Zoom and using it that way. Oops, I don't know what just happened there. Sorry. I wasn't even touching anything. Okay, one more slide. So thank you to everybody who supports the Clements Library in a variety of ways, and we really appreciate your vote of confidence. Today, we will paste a link in the chat with the opportunity to donate to our fellowship programs if you feel so inclined. This year, many of our fellows had to defer to 2021 because of the pandemic, but that remains a key part of our mission, supporting the research on these wonderful historical subjects. So, all right. And again, we'll see you on September 18th for our next Bookworm. All right, now we'll take a look at what we have for questions. I'll just remind everybody to go ahead and continue to put your questions in the Q&A section, and we will answer questions until probably around 11:15. All right, so let's see. What does Margaret say? I was born to a francophone mother from Joliet, Quebec, and a Scottish national father, and currently attend the University of Michigan, and have always been surprised that Franco-Nova Scotian and Franco-Manitobans and Franco-Ontarians were so ignored, disregarded, unknown to the obviously much more populous province of Quebec. Can you talk about why that is and how that happened? Is this a side effect of 19th and 20th century romanticism and nationalism?
Yes. Up until the 1960s, there were more connections, cultural connections between Francophone communities across Canada, but also the US. A lot of French Canadians left for other parts of North America between the 1840s and 1920s. A lot went to near Boston because there were opportunities. When I say a lot, I mean more than 1 million over like half a century. That's a lot. And people say today Quebec's population would be much higher had not like French Canadians left. But in the 1960s, the nationalism in Quebec went from being a French Canadian nationalism to a Quebec nationalism. And that's why in Quebec today, if you talk to people on the street, they're not going to refer to themselves as French Canadians. I know that everyone else in North America called them French Canadians, but they would look at you funny. They would be like, no, I'm a Quebecois. I'm a Quebecer. And that started in the 1960s. And in the process, a lot of Quebecers kind of forgot about these connections with other Francophone communities, including the Acadians and the Maritimes. And that was the case for like 60 years. And that's one of the reasons why still today, a lot of French Canadians in Quebec are not aware of like their cousins, distant cousins living in other parts of North America. But in the last few years, it has started to change. Quebecers are more and more aware of the struggles of other Francophone people in other provinces. To give a specific example, in Ontario, I know it's like when you look on the map, it's right next door to Quebec, but still, a lot of Quebecers don't know much about Toronto, about Ontario. They don't know that there are French Canadians there, but the French Canadians in Ontario, they've been asking for a French university, and it was a very difficult struggle. And in the last few years, the provincial government of Ontario said, actually, we don't have the money to do that. And after it had been approved, and that really triggered like a lot of anger among Francophone people in Ontario, and they received some support from Quebecers. So the French university is happening. It's opening downtown Toronto like next year or the year after. So there is a new movement right now of connections happening. It's very exciting, and hopefully it will continue.
Thank you. Thanks. All right. Tom is asking, how were the French settlers recruited to come to the Detroit area?
Different ways. Some of them came on their own. They got like in canoes on the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and made their way to the Detroit River for the fur trade. And then they discovered that actually they could also farm, and over time they became more farmers than fur traders. In other cases, at the time of New France, the French government sponsored migrations, tried to convince people to move. After New France, after 1760, the migrations continued, but now it was not sponsored by any government. It was really people that were attracted by the milder climate of the Detroit River, because if you've been to Quebec in February, you know there's a lot of snow. If people in Michigan think that there's a lot of snow in the winter, you've never been to Quebec City. Just a warning. But basically, starting in around 1800, there's a new wave starting really because of French Canadians leaving Quebec, because it's getting really difficult to find decent pieces of land within Quebec. So they're attracted. The connection with Detroit still exists, and they're attracted. And that's one of the things that I'm researching with Karen Marrero, and we have an article coming out in a few weeks. So there's more to do on that, but yes, there's a new wave, early 19th century, of French Canadians arriving in the Detroit River region.
Great, thank you. Sarah is asking, how long did the French people remain Francophone?
On the American side, they were totally assimilated by the First World War, and they started to be assimilated around the Civil War, because for the first time, French people had to get out of their own community and enroll. So they got in touch with Americans who only spoke English. So they were forced to learn English, and that transition was completed by the First World War. On the Canadian side, there's still a few thousand descendants of the French people who still speak French in Windsor and the region. but there's a lot more that were assimilated. But in Windsor, everywhere you will see people with a French surname, and you can personally, I know that's 18th century, but very often they don't know much about their family history.
Thank you. Tom is also wondering, were most of the early French settlers literate?
No, almost all of them were illiterate. That's one of the issues with for historians, is that it's not easy to find sources like letters telling us, what's happening, and personal letters and things like that. It's a little tricky. That's why we had to use other sources, more like legal documents. Yeah.
Okay. Jim Davis is asking, I see from the map of 1810 that a number of long lot farms, also known as ribbon farms, are found on both banks of the Rouge River. Dr. Teasdale, could you please discuss the historical roles played by the Rouge River, a river I got to know from my frequent boyhood explorations nearly 70 years ago?
Yeah, it's a settlement that was established in the 1770s because at that time it was getting more and more difficult for French people to have access to new land along the Detroit River, and they had large families, very often more than 10 children. So these younger generations, they needed farms, they needed land, and they started to migrate to nearby rivers to replicate a way of life of living by a river. So that's why the River Rouge became very popular. The difference between the Detroit River and the River Rouge is that Detroit River, it really started at the time of New France, and it was grants given by pieces of land given by the French government to settlers. And but after 1760, the French government is gone, cannot do that anymore. So the local French, they make agreements with local indigenous people to have access to new land. And the River Rouge, that was the Potawatomi area. So that led to the writing of what we call Indian deeds. So everyone who lived in the late 18th century along the River Rouge was someone who had acquired the land from an Indian deed or from someone who had received an Indian deed. So that's how it started in the River Rouge. They wanted to replicate the same way of life as along the Detroit River.
Thank you. Let's see. Bill Marvel is asking, do you distinguish between Quebecois and Acadian, and do you focus on the distribution of one over the other?
Oh yeah, there's a clear difference. The accent is very different. You can tell within a few words. But yeah, if I travel to New Brunswick or Nova Scotia and I talk to Acadians, yes, I see the difference. They see my different. They can hear my different accent. But there's a lot of Acadians who ended up after the deportation that started in 1755. There's a lot that ended up in Quebec. And it sounds funny to say because both spoke French, but they were assimilated into the French Canadian culture. So it means that after one or two generations, they lost their accent, their Acadian accent. The only thing that survived basically was the surname. And today in Quebec, you can see some names, some surnames that are typically Acadian, like Leblanc, for example. In English, we say LeBlanc, but that's very Acadian. There's quite a few others like that. And growing up in Quebec, you don't think about it, but you know, like a LeBlanc family. But if you go back a few generations, they came from Acadia.
Thank you. Tom is asking, what happened to the Native American villages located around Detroit?
So eventually, really, Pontiac's War becomes kind of a tipping point in a lot of ways. As kind of after that conflict, a lot of the indigenous people start moving out of the immediate vicinity. So a lot of the Odawas are going to move down to the Maumee River, down further south into Michigan. The Potawatomis are going to start moving into the River Rouge area and away from kind of this immediate vicinity. The Wyandots stay in what's their second village, basically where Guillaume is now, in Windsor, and not until the 19th century do they give up that tract of land, but they're also located south in settlement that they called Brownstown, and their descendants are still there today. So, and then the Ojibwas a little bit farther afield basically stay there, never have left their territory. So even when Alexis de Tocqueville shows up in the 1830s, right? 1820s, 1830s, he still encounters lots of indigenous people in this region. So it's tempting to think that they kind of just evaporate, but they're still there for a while. Eventually, because of the Indian Removal Act, most of the people that were Detroit end up in Indian territory. So today, a lot of their descendants are in Oklahoma and Kansas because of that history of settler colonialism. But they remain for quite a while, and some are still there today.
All right, thank you. Tom is saying, many of the French fur traders cohabitated with Native Americans. Do some of Michigan's Native Americans claim some French ancestry?
Absolutely, and this is probably a better question for Karen to plug her book as well. But yeah, they're absolutely, and I know Guillaume addresses this a little bit. We don't necessarily see the same volume of intermarriage as we do in some places that the French were in the Great Lakes. And Guillaume has some I think, convincing explanations for why it's not as intense here as it may be in other parts. But as Karen shows, there are some really important families that basically are Métis families, are mixed descendant families that are still in the area. So there is that really strong connection, and yeah, that tradition of métissage or mixing that becomes complicated, as Guillaume was talking about later, as kind of the ideas of whiteness start to really calcify in the late 18th century, and people are making decisions about whether they're going to identify primarily with their indigenous or with their more European ancestry. So yeah, certainly there's a lot of that going on, and a lot of it's the way that we see a lot of places in North America, a lot of that intermarriage and cultural mixing.
Yeah, and that's why you find a lot of members of Native communities in the U.S. and some reservations where they do have a French surname. So at one point in time, there was intermarriage, but these individuals today, in these cases, they would not identify as Métis, they would identify as Native. There's still so much to do. Like, I've met recently people in Essex County near Windsor that they say my family has mixed ancestry, and they were like their ancestors were like moving around quite a bit up until like the 1830s, when things were changing a big time, and they had to find a place to settle down, and sometimes it happened in Essex County. So after like a few generations of moving around a lot, that stopped. And yes, they're still here today. They just in a lot of cases they don't have any specific status, but they know their history.
I think that's an important distinction as well. They may not be kind of enrolled members of any tribe, but they're kind of layers of complications about that, because clearly they are indigenous and they have that sense and that heritage, even though the federal government doesn't necessarily recognize them. as such.
Yeah, race and identity is a complicated matter for sure. Yeah, on a personal note, I'm a Native American descendant. My father was an enrolled member of the tribe, but I'm not because it's not allowed as part of their constitution. So yeah, so it is definitely a complicated legacy. So Dawn is very astute in noticing that when I was copying and pasting into the poll questions, I somehow left out Fort Pontchartrain. So, but yes, and I thought when I pulled it up, when I pulled up the answer, I thought, I feel like something happened here, but on the fly, I couldn't quite puzzle out what I had done.
Yeah, I think I saw an earlier version in which Fort Pontchartrain was there. So
Yes, yes. So yes, Dawn, you are correct. And somehow in my copying and pasting, I left it off. So there you go. David is saying, I am a tour guide and historian in Detroit, but the indigenous history of the area is not my forte. I usually explain the name of the peoples who lived and still live here, important events like Pontiac's War and Tecumseh's Confederation in 1812, but I feel like I could do much, much better. Any advice for me or important events, people I should be conferring to the general public when I give these tours? Thank you.
I could go on for a while about that. Yeah, so a couple of things that immediately spring to mind is there are actually several village sites for most of the groups that lived at Detroit. So the Ottawas, for example, when they come in the early, in 1701, 1702, lived just north of what today is Detroit. But they leave after a conflict in 1706. When they come back, they're relocated over to the Windsor side of the border, where they stay until basically Pontiac's War. The Wyandottes have a similar story. They start basically just south of Detroit due to a conflict with the Ottawas. They move down to the Bois Blanc Island, or Boblo Island, I think is how it's pronounced in the area, and then come back to basically adjacent to the Ottawas over in Windsor. So that can also help, I think, to say that there's not just kind of a static history, but there's a lot going on and a lot of movement going on, and talk about that past. One thing that's also, I'm not sure, you may talk about it on the tour already, is one of the really defining events in early 18th century Detroit is the conflict with the Meskwakis, or Foxes, who basically, through a complicated story, are invited by Anton Lomé de la Cadillac, who we could talk a lot about him as well, but who shows up and he basically, he wants to make a profit off Detroit, so he invites everybody here, kind of oblivious apparently to the fact that the Meskwakis had been fighting against most of the people living in Detroit for generations. And so kind of predictably, there's a conflict here in 1712. So there's, I believe, a fighting island in the river where some of the conflict happened. So you can kind of point to that direction as well. And that's a good place too to talk about some of the kinds of relationships between the native peoples here, right? So conflicts between the Meskwakis and other people, and how that kind of interweaves into the story. And then that's also part of the story about the French population as well. So because of conflicts like that, the French don't start really intensively planting land until after that conflict. And so a lot of what the establishment of this French agricultural community starts a little bit later because of some of that content. So some ideas to think about.
Great, thank you. Ted is wondering if there's a preferred Anglo spelling of Potawatomi. And he has one up there that he has sort of settled.
Sure, yeah, and I was previewing some of the questions and I saw that. Yeah, I think that one is also, the one without the E is also one of the standard versions of that. There's been a movement toward pronouncing it Potawatomi, which is closer to what it would actually be in the language. With a lot of these names, they're very heavily anglicized. Some first Francicized and then anglicized from that. You see this with the Wyandots as well, who the French call Hurons. Not exactly sure where that comes from, but it's a history that they're known by that name, but they called themselves the Wyandots. So it's a long answer to a short question, but yeah, I think that spelling of Potawatomi is also used by several of the descendant communities.
Thank you. Barbara is asking, Andrew, do you know why there was such a drop in population in the population estimates?
Sure. So are you referring, I don't know if you can see, if we can go back to the chart.
Let me just find it quick. There it is.
So there certainly are ebbs and flows over time. Yeah, so it goes back and forth depending on some of the relations here. The Wyandots, for example, many of them start settling basically in the area of Sandusky, Ohio, in the beginning of the 1730s. So that accounts for some of those population fluctuations. Certainly with the Odawas, they are moving back and forth between Detroit, Michilimackinac, Saginaw, different places within their kind of traditional homeland. And so that accounts for some of the ebbs and flows, but also this is far from kind of an official census. So basically the commanders of French forces are asking local commandants how many warriors are in each group, and they're just kind of doing some back of the envelope calculations, estimates. So I think some of the fluctuations are just because some of the commandants get it wrong and underestimate how many going on. So I think there is some flux, some change over time, but I think any drastic changes are probably coming from just inaccurate estimates.
Thank you. Did Detroit, Elizabeth's asking, did Detroit ever have anything close to Napoleonic law that we find in the state of Louisiana today?
I really doubt. I don't think so. There's a lot of differences between French Detroit and French Louisiana. I tell people that French Detroit was more of an ancien regime, old regime kind of settlement, and New Orleans is a mix of ancien regime, but also more like 19th century when the French culture, the fin cuisine and everything is emerging. Louisiana is still connected to France with the Atlantic world, and this is something not happening at all in Detroit. So I'm not that familiar with Louisiana in terms of laws, but I will eventually because that's part of one of my projects. But no, I think it's very different.
Thank you. Tom is asking, after the 1805 fire, were some of the displaced people granted additional land adjacent to the town?
I forget the details how they proceeded to sort out the land question. I know that people had to petition to get, if people were living in the fort, and they wanted to basically have again a spot, a lot in the town. They had to petition. I'm not sure what happened beyond the walls of where the town was located, but I know that very close to the town, you had farms, and these farms were not affected by the fire. So it's really the town itself. Um, I'm not familiar with the process of how it worked for people to sort out the urban like environment in terms of properties and stuff.
Thank you. Mike is asking if you discuss the Kempau family in your book.
Yes, a little bit. I talk about a few of them, including Joseph, who was the most famous, Joseph Campo, because he owned quite a few tracts of land, and especially north of Detroit, around Lake St. Clair, Clinton River, that kind of place. He became very wealthy. There's still so much more to do because he was literate and he wrote a lot of things, not only like ledgers, transactions and things like that, but he also wrote quite a few personal letters in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. So yes, I talk about him a little bit. I talk about him how in my chapter 7, how as a merchant, he would be he would have customers from the Canadian side of the river in the early 19th century. And it's interesting that he, in his ledgers, for example, in 1801, 1802, he specifies if the customer is from across the river, meaning across the border. He would say, yeah, he's from across. That's basically what he would say in French. I suspect that he did not know all the time if someone was coming from across the river, but he does mention that quite a few times. So it's very interesting to see also what people would purchase from him and that kind of thing. So there's a lot more to do because he was very wealthy. There's also some connections between the Campo family and the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. Some of his children went to that university because they were Catholic and that kind of thing. So yes, there's more to do.
Great, thank you. This is a good question. You know that I forget that everybody doesn't know about, but Ernie's asking, could you please discuss how and why those long lot farms were set up as opposed to the square farm?
Yeah, it started in Quebec. It was all about adapting to the physical environment to give access to more people to the river, the St. Lawrence River in Quebec. It existed in France, but it was not as central to the way of life of the French people as in New France, at least in the St. Lawrence Valley. And it was all about having access to the river, and the French people in Detroit replicated the landscape that existed in the St. Lawrence Valley. So because there's a lot of similarities between the St. Lawrence Valley in Quebec and the Detroit River region.
Thank you. Linda is mentioning that there was an Ann Arbor-based group, Mustard's Retreat, who wrote a mostly fact-based song, Detroit 1763, about Pontiac's War, mostly from the Native American point of view. So just
check that out.
Yeah, something to look into. So we're getting almost to 11:30. Maybe the two of you could just scroll through the other questions and see if there are any that you want to answer quickly, and otherwise I can always send out the list of questions and can follow up a little bit. And in the meantime, thank you so much, everybody, for all of your wonderful questions and for participating in this discussion. We really appreciate it. Any last moment comments?
I was looking at the questions, but I think we've answered
Many of them.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's what I thought too. So just wanted to see if you had any additions based on those questions. So
No, but I would like to thank the Clements Library for inviting me, and it was also a pleasure to see to be part of it with Andrew. So we've known each other, I think, since a conference in Quebec City in 2008. So and we've been in touch ever since, and we follow each other, publications and stuff, and it's always a pleasure.
yes.
I'd second that. That was my first academic conference. Guillaume organized a panel on French Detroit. So kind of taking this journey together.
That's very nice. It's so great to hear. Thank you both so much for sharing your work today and all of your interesting information about Detroit, helping to broaden our perspectives on what that history really looks like. And we look forward to staying in touch with you and hearing more as you continue to publish and to work. And thank you everybody for joining us today. As a reminder, we will be going to once a month, and we'll see you again on September 18th. So goodbye everyone. Have a great weekend.